Good morning. We are continuing with our chapter 4, the early Ojibwe. We're finishing up reading the chapter today. So tomorrow we will start our project, our seasons project. So my friends at home, you'll find out what that's all about in tomorrow's assignment. So we are finishing reading, starting on page 64. So make sure you're on page 64 in your social studies book. Coming changes. We've read about all the different seasons that the Ojibwe go through and what happens in their seasons. Now we're going to find out a little bit more about changes that happen to the Ojibwe. The Ojibwe were not alone in the land of woods and water. During their years of living in the east and migrating to the west, they encountered many other people. As in the case with all nations, the Ojibwe had complex relationships with other American Indian nations. Some, like the Cree, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, were allies and trading partners. Other groups, such as the Iroquois to the east, were enemies who fought one another. So if we look down at that map at the bottom of 64, we can see where the Ojibwe Nation was, all around Lake Superior, and we can see all the different Indian nations surrounding them. The Cree, the Dakota, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Iroquois, Mississaugas, and the Algonquin. Some of them they were friends with, and some they were enemies with. By the mid-1800s, the Ojibwe had settled on the shores around Lake Superior. They became very familiar with the people who inhabited the westernmost lands of the Great Lakes region, the Dakota. At first, the Ojibwe and the Dakota eyed each other warily. Sometimes they fought. Other times they traded with one another and feasted together. In 1679, at a gathering near present-day Duluth, the two sides formed an alliance. So if they're making an alliance, they're becoming friends. They remained at peace with one another for many years after making this agreement. The Dakota allowed the Ojibwe to move farther west into what is now northern Minnesota. This land was land that had traditionally been Dakota territory. In return, the Ojibwe agreed to supply the Dakota with new types of trade goods. These new goods, tools, cloth, weapons, and more, came from men who were new to the Great Lakes region. Through their allies to the east, the Ojibwe had certainly heard of and probably met some of these new traders early in the 1600s. They came from across the Atlantic Ocean from lands called France, England, and Holland. They had light skin, pale eyes, and hairy faces. They were eager to trade their goods for animal furs. So these are the first Europeans coming over, those trappers, the fur traders. So it's the first white men coming over and trading with the American Indians. Trade was now a new concept for the Ojibwe and Dakota. After all, they had been trading for tools and materials with their native neighbors for centuries. Trade with Europeans was different, though. It provided the Dakota and Ojibwe with tools and materials they had not used before, stuff coming over from Europe. So it was new things, not stuff that they found locally, stuff that was just already here. It wasn't natural. It was new things being brought over. It also connected them with cultures and ideas of how to live that were very different from their own. The fur trade, as it came to be known, was the start of a new and complex relationship between American Indian nations and people from the countries of Europe. We're going to learn in chapter 5 about the fur trade, about the new things that they were getting from those European traders. So we're going to be getting into what those kinds of things were that they traded for. American Indian sovereignty. Like modern nations today, all of the American Indian nations were mentioned in this chapter. The Ojibwe, Dakota, Cree, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Iroquois represent independent nations. These nations were sovereign. That is, they ruled themselves. The people of these nations made decisions about where to live, who to trade with, and who to fight based upon what was most important for their people. The alliance made by the Dakota and Ojibwe in 1679 is a good example of how two sovereign nations negotiated an agreement that benefited both of them. They both got stuff out of being friends with one another. Today, the Dakota, Ojibwe, and other American Indian nations have independent tribal governments that are sovereign and separate from the U.S. government. As you read this book, you will learn more about the complicated relationship between American Indian nations and the U.S. government. So they live here in the United States, but they have their own laws, their own rules, they're sovereign nations. So we're going to find out what that all means. They say it's complicated. It is. So I can't just go into a brief explanation now. We have to wait till we get to it further in the book to find out what it means to be sovereign, a sovereign nation that lives in the United States. So the next section, this last section, what my grandmother taught me, I want you to think about what are some things that you've learned from your grandparents or great-grandparents. What is something that's been taught to you by an elder in your family? Does anybody have any examples? Andrea?
My aunt taught me to embroider.
Okay, embroidering.
She's not really an elder, but
She's older than you, so that's an elder. Has anybody learned anything from their grandparents or great-grandparents, like a card game, a recipe? Andrea?
My grandmother taught me her cookie recipe and how to bake, like do the frosting, and my mom taught me like how to make arepas.
Yeah. Sometimes it's the more it's the food from where they came from. So I bet they made that a lot in Venezuela. Yep. That's like Mr. Gambino's mom has taught my kids about making her homemade sauce. The true Italian sauce, not the kind that you get out of a jar. So they're passing on that tradition. Molly?
My grandma is teaching me some Thanksgiving recipe that her great grandmother.
Perfect. So it's that recipe that's been handed down from her great grandma, handed down to her, now she's passing it down to you. So that is awesome. That's what we're talking about here. Those things being passed down from generation to generation. So I'm going to have you read this section on your own, learning about some of the things that were passed, that she's passing on down to her grandchildren, things that were passed on down to her. So we're going to read this bit on your own, and then it's a shortened day today because it was a mass day. So you're just going to read on your own, and then we'll be ready to work on our project tomorrow. So our friends at home are going to finish reading this chapter by yourself, and tomorrow we'll find out about the project. So I will see you later. Have a wonderful day.